and welcome to the France 24 interview. My guest today is the coordinator for strategic communications of the National Security Council, John Kirby. Thank you for being with us today.
Glad to do it. Thank you.
So we're going to discuss quite a few issues of foreign policy, but first I want to start, of course, with the war in Ukraine. We're nearing the one-year mark of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Could you give me an assessment of the administration when it comes to what the situation is right now, when it comes to Ukraine, but also when it comes to how Russia is right now?
Well, the fighting around Bakhmut and the Donbass is still quite vicious. And of course, Bakhmut poses no strategic value for Mr. Putin or for the Russian army. It seems to be a personal goal of Mr. Prigozhin, who keeps throwing convicts at this fight. So that fighting is still quite vicious. The fighting is not quite as kinetic as we would say along the rest of the south, but we do expect that as the weather improves, that the Russians will try to make additional offensive moves anywhere along that front. That's why we're so focused on making sure we're helping the Ukrainians prepare for all that. We've got battalion-level combined arms training going on outside of Ukraine for Ukrainian battalions. We're providing Bradley fighting vehicles, Stryker infantry combat vehicles. The Germans have just announced recently that they're going to provide some Leopard tanks. The British are going to provide some tanks. We're doing all we can to help the Ukrainian forces get good at what we call combined arms warfare, because they believe that they're going to need those skills in open terrain and in what could be heavy fighting come spring.
The U.S. has already sent or pledged about $30 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. Right now, there is still discussion on long-range missiles, on fighter jets. The U.S. so far has said no to those. Why is the U.S. not willing to do that right now?
We're working in lockstep with the Ukrainians almost every day about what their security needs are and the kinds of weapons and platforms they desire. And so we're working this in real time with them. And as the war has evolved, so too has our contributions to Ukraine. I won't get ahead of where we're going here, but we are going to constantly be communicating with the Ukrainians about what they need for the fight that they're in. And just as critically, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the fight that we expect them to be in going forward.
But we had a sort of a similar discussion with the Patriot missiles, with the Abrams tanks. In the beginning, it was a no, and then there was a change from the United States. And the Ukrainians keep saying that they need this decision-making to go a little bit faster. What's the U.S.'s answer to that?
We're talking to them every day. And if you just look at the pace, the size, and the scale of the U.S. security assistance alone, it's historic, it's unprecedented. Sometimes between the time the president orders something to go to Ukraine and the time it gets into the hands of a Ukrainian soldier can be a matter of days. That's never been achieved before. I understand, we all understand, that President Zelensky's in the middle of a vicious war. His country has been invaded. His people are being slaughtered. Of course, he wants more, and he wants it faster. Everybody understands that. But the United States has literally been leading the world in contributions to Ukraine and in convening other countries, like we did this week in Brussels, to do the same.
Now, of course, the ultimate goal is peace. We're hearing that from all corners of the world. Right now, what does this peace look like, and is it really realistic, at least in the short term, to have peace?
So 2 thoughts here. First of all, there could be peace today. As you and I are sitting here, all Mr. Putin has to do is take his troops out of Ukraine. They don't belong there anyway. That's obviously not going to happen. So short of it ending today, what we are going to do, what we're focused on, is making sure that Ukraine can continue to succeed on the battlefield. And my goodness, they have achieved things beyond what so many people thought they could in the last 12 months. So that if and when Mr. Zelensky, and only Mr. Zelensky can determine this, is ready to sit down and have a negotiation with Mr. Putin, that he can do so with strength, that he can do so with the conviction that the international community in the United States is behind him, that he can do so with the wind at his back. So that's what we're going to focus on, succeed on the battlefield so that he can succeed at the negotiating table. What that looks like, what circumstances, what things would he be willing to negotiate with Mr. Putin, only President Zelensky can determine.
In the national security strategy that was released last year, there was a clear focus. There was a current immediate threat from Russia, but there was also this focus on China as being the long-term competition, the long-term challenge for the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about China. We've had the recent events with the Chinese spy balloon that was shut down by the United States. The Chinese accused the Americans of doing the same thing over their airspace, which the US has denied. It seems that the sort of reset of relations between the US and China that started with the meeting between President Biden and President Xi is a little bit off to a rocky start. What is the situation? What is the assessment of the relationship right now between the US and China?
The president has been very consistent. He seeks a strategic competition with China. A competition, oh, by the way, that President Biden believes that we are well poised to succeed in, but not conflict. That hasn't changed. Even in the wake of this spy balloon, that hasn't changed. We do not seek a conflict with China. And when the president sat down with President Xi in Bali a few months ago, both leaders said, and I believe that both leaders believe this, that this is one of the most consequential bilateral relationships in the world, and both of us have to be responsible stewards of that relationship. And both of them are committed to moving ahead in that form. At least they were in Bali, and President Biden certainly still is. It's harder to do that now, given that the Chinese flew a high-altitude balloon intended for surveillance and intelligence collection right over our country. So you can understand why this isn't the most appropriate time for Secretary Blinken to go and have discussions with the Chinese about how to move this relationship forward, at least not right now. That was his goal, that was his hope, and he was almost on the airplane, ready to leave, when we discovered this Chinese spy balloon over the country. Now look, we believe that, again, this is an important relationship, and we would certainly like to see it on better footing than it is right now. But the fact that it isn't right now is due to Chinese actions, their decision to fly a spy balloon over our country. There will be a time in the future when it's appropriate for Secretary Blinken to go to Beijing. There will be a time when it's appropriate to have the kinds of discussions that both leaders wanted us, our two teams, to have coming out of Bali. That time is just not now. And
talking about China's influence, China's behavior, as well as Russia's behavior, I want to focus on the African continent. There was the African Leaders Summit recently here in Washington. A lot of leaders were here. There were a lot of discussions. The US made clear the message was, this is about Africa, it's not about any other country, and the focus is the relationship between the US and African countries. But you can't deny the influence of the Chinese, the influence of the Russians on the continent. How much of that was part of the conversation with African leaders?
We had a broad agenda for the African Leaders Summit, and as you might imagine, there were a lot of topics discussed that are of importance not just to the continent's leadership, but to us and to the world, because what happens on the continent does affect and reverberate around the world. So it matters to everybody. And it was everything from food security. And don't think for a minute that Putin's war in Ukraine isn't affecting food security on the continent, because it absolutely is, despite what Foreign Minister Lavrov would have you believe. Energy security. Again, we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which Mr. Putin's war has affected energy security, supply and demand around the world. Climate change, counterterrorism. I could go on and on. Now, one more thing. You're right about the Russians and the Chinese trying to exert influence on the continent. And many African leaders are seeing that influence, those exertions, come with a cost. Come with a cost to the African people. Come with a cost to their citizens, to their families, to their lives and livelihoods. High interest loans by the Chinese that all of a sudden some African countries can't pay back. When the United States gets involved as we have been and as we will be. It is to our mutual benefit, and we will always lead with our values, and that is something that you can't put a price tag on, and it's certainly not something that the Russians and the Chinese are doing.
Can we get any information on the president's trip to Africa, a time frame, a location?
I have no schedule or trips for the president to speak to.
And a final question on the Iran nuclear deal. The U.S. seems to say that right now it's not the priority to have those talks. The Iranians seem to say that there are some messages being exchanged. What's the status from the U.S. point of view of the JCPOA right now?
There's no change right now. It's still not on our agenda. It's difficult to put it on the agenda when, as we were discussing it months ago, the Iranians were not negotiating in good faith, not negotiating seriously on the core issues, which were their nuclear ambitions. And they were trying to lard the talks up with all kinds of proposals that had nothing to do with their nuclear weapon ambitions. So that's one. Two, it's difficult to make it a key part of the agenda when the Iranian regime continues to brutalize its own people and visit violence upon them for peaceful protest. And so what we're going to do is continue to hold Iran accountable for the way it's treating its own people, and by the way they're supporting Russia in Ukraine. So we should end this interview the way we started it, because Iran is actually, the regime in Tehran is actually tangibly and demonstrably helping Mr. Putin kill innocent Ukrainian people that posed a threat to nobody, let alone Russia. But by providing them hundreds of drones and with lethal capability, Iran is directly and demonstrably now assisting Russia in this war. We're going to keep holding the regime accountable. The JCPOA is not on the agenda right now.
Thank you, John Kirby, and thank you for being with us and watching the interview on France 24. Stay tuned for more news coming right up.
Special event.
A year ago, on February 24th, Russian troops invaded Ukraine. Now the entire France 24 news team is going into action. Join me next Friday live from Kyiv. On the program, retrospectives from key events, analysis from experts, and special correspondents from all across the embattled nation. Can the Ukrainian army, galvanized by President Vladimir Zelensky and supported by the West, resist for much longer? How far will Russian President Vladimir Putin go? What does the future hold for Russia and for Ukraine?
Ukraine, 1 year later, on France 24 and France24.com.